You are sitting in a warm room in the year 1453. Outside, the walls of Constantinople have stood for over 1,000 years. No army has ever broken them. Not the Persians, not the Arabs, not anyone. You believe, like everyone around you, that these walls are eternal. Then you hear the sound. A cannon, larger than anything built before, firing a stone ball the size of a man. And in that moment, everything you thought you knew about the limits of power quietly stops being true. That cannon belonged to the Ottomans, and the real reason they terrified Europe for 600 years is far stranger than simple conquest. You probably picture the Ottoman Empire as one more entry in a long list of historical empires, a name in a textbook, sandwiched between the Byzantines and the modern nation of Turkey. But that flattens something extraordinary. This was not a kingdom that got lucky once. This was a state engineered, generation after generation, to expand, absorb, and endure, while most of its neighbors were still fighting over castles. Let's start with the fear itself, because fear is not the same as hatred, and Europe's relationship with the Ottomans was soaked in something closer to dread. For over 3 centuries, European monarchs planned their wars, their alliances, even their trade routes, around the looming presence of a power to their east. Historian Caroline Finkel, whose research reconstructs the empire's military and administrative machinery in extraordinary detail, has described how Ottoman advances into the Balkans and Central Europe forced entire kingdoms to reorganize their defenses around a single question. Where will they strike next? Why? Because the Ottomans didn't fight like everyone else. Their military was not a feudal levy of knights who showed up when their lord called them. It was something closer to a professional machine. At its core stood the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps built through a system called the Devshirme, where young boys from conquered Christian territories were taken, trained, and converted into some of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. You might expect this system to breed resentment and rebellion. Instead, for centuries, it produced fierce loyalty. Historian Godfrey Goodwin, who spent decades studying Ottoman military institutions, has argued that many Janissaries rose to genuine positions of power and wealth within the empire, creating a strange paradox where some of the Sultan's most feared soldiers had once been the children of his enemies. Think about what that means. A boy taken from a village in the Balkans could grow up to command armies that terrorized the very region he came from. The empire didn't just conquer territory. It converted people into instruments of its own expansion. And then there was the cannon. Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old when he took the throne, understood something most European rulers had not yet grasped. Gunpowder could break any wall if you built the weapon large enough. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had actually first offered his cannon-building skills to the Byzantines, who couldn't afford him. Mehmet could. The result was a bombard, so massive it took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to move it. When it fired on the walls of Constantinople in 1453, it didn't just breach a fortress. It ended an entire era of military thinking. Walls that had defined defensive warfare for 1,000 years were suddenly obsolete. Here's where it gets stranger. The fall of Constantinople wasn't the end of Ottoman expansion. It was the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, Ottoman forces pushed deep into Hungary, threatened Vienna itself twice, and controlled trade routes stretching from North Africa to the Persian Gulf. At its height, the empire covered roughly 2 million square miles across 3 continents, governing a staggering diversity of religions, languages, and cultures under one administrative system. You might expect an empire built on conquest to rule through pure brutality. But that's not quite the full picture. The Ottomans developed a system called the millet, which allowed religious communities, Christians, Jews, and others, to govern many of their own internal affairs under their own religious leaders, while still paying taxes and remaining loyal to the Sultan. Historian Karen Barkey, who has studied how the empire managed such enormous diversity without constant civil war, describes this as a form of negotiated coexistence rather than pure domination. It wasn't equality, but it was stability, and stability let the empire hold together in ways that pure force never could have. Why does that matter to you, sitting here centuries later? Because the fear Europe felt wasn't only about swords and cannons. It was about facing a civilization that had solved problems European kingdoms were still struggling with. How do you govern people who don't share your religion? How do you fund a state large enough to project power across 3 continents? The Ottomans had answers. Fragmented, divided Europe often did not. Consider Vienna in 1683. Ottoman forces laid siege to the city, and for weeks the fate of Central Europe hung in the balance. If the city had fallen, historians have long debated how differently the map of Europe might look today. It didn't fall. A coalition of European forces broke the siege at the last possible moment. But the fact that such a debate even exists tells you something. This wasn't a fringe power nibbling at Europe's edges. This was a civilization capable of reshaping the continent's entire future, and everyone at the time knew it. The economic reach was just as staggering as the military one. Ottoman control over key trade routes between Europe and Asia forced European powers to seek entirely new paths to the wealth of the East. Some historians argue that the search for alternative sea routes, driven partly by Ottoman dominance over overland trade, helped push European exploration outward, eventually contributing to the Age of Discovery. In other words, fear of one empire helped accidentally launch the beginning of another era entirely. So what finally slowed an empire that had terrified an entire continent for so long? Not a single dramatic defeat, slow structural decline, internal rebellions, and eventually the same modernizing pressures that reshaped every other empire of the era. But even in decline, the Ottoman Empire held on for centuries longer than most expect, not collapsing until the aftermath of World War I in the 20th century. Here's the modern mirror. You live in a world shaped by borders, tensions, and alliances that were drawn, in part, in reaction to a power most people today rarely think about. The very idea of a balance of power in Europe, the diplomatic dance of alliances that still echoes in international relations today, was shaped in large part by centuries of maneuvering around Ottoman strength. You inherited a version of the world built partly in response to a fear that once kept entire kingdoms awake at night. So picture yourself back in that room in 1453, listening to a cannon the size of nothing anyone had heard before. That sound wasn't just the end of a city's walls. It was the sound of an old world realizing it no longer understood the rules of power. And in some quiet way, the world has been rebuilding itself around that realization ever since.